Hello, everyone, and welcome to Shannon Q. I am Shannon Q, and I am joined today by Hector Garcia. And this is a long time coming. Hector and I actually met in person a year and a half ago, probably, when I was in Austin. It was maybe even more than that. I think it was April of.
Pre-COVID,
It was pre-COVID. Yeah, it was pre-COVID.
ACA.
Yeah, we met at the ACA a while ago and had a really great chat, actually, outside in the parking lot for a while, and wanted to do something together, and it just never coalesced until now. So, Hector, I'm really excited that you're finally here. Before we get into it, why don't you tell everybody who you are and where they can find you?
Well, I'm a clinical psychologist. I work with primarily combat-related PTSD. I'm an author. I've written a couple books. Alpha Gods, Sex, Power, and Partisanship is my second book, and it's really about the evolved psychology of politics and what tears societies apart. And you can reach me on hector-garcia.com. That's my website. I've got a new YouTube channel and I just went on Patreon, so I'm just starting that up. So I'm sure that'll be in the description. But
It all is, yeah, it's all down there. And
yeah,
I strongly encourage everybody to check out Hector and Hector's work and his new endeavor on YouTube. That's really, really exciting that you're going to be more accessible to more people. I think that what you have to say is really interesting and worth listening to. So
oh,
I
thank
hope
you. I'm really excited about it. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's just
no.
brand new. I just put out my first video a couple of weeks ago with the help of Drew McCoy from Genetically Modified Skeptic. I called him and says, "Hey, I want to do something," and he says, "Come over." So
He's great.
we recorded in his studio and he produced it for me. It came out really good. It was going to be like a litmus test, like will people be interested in this stuff? And it was a big hit and people wanted more, so I'm giving them more.
Well, I'm very,
So,
very glad. And I am a huge fan of Alpha Gods. That is a
oh,
good book. Or Alpha Gods, sorry.
awesome.
That's a great
Thank you.
book. I've actually listened to it twice now. It's my go-to. I've re-listened to it because I listen to audiobooks while I'm driving or podcasts, and I've listened to yours driving cross country like a couple of different times. It's a really good book. I strongly
Oh, that's
recommend.
great. That's
Yeah,
great.
it's
I'm
really
happy that I can reach people. That's why I write. That's why I speak.
yeah.
It's a vocation for me.
Yeah, and I love it. And now we're gonna get past the pleasantries and we're gonna start talking about, like religion and politics and sex and people, all of the things you're not supposed to talk about, which are my favorite things to talk about.
Yeah, I go right towards those things for some reason. What do you know?
Me too. We have a lot in common, you and I, apparently.
Yeah.
So your new book, I haven't actually had the opportunity to read it yet, so I'm excited to do that. I will very shortly. I think it's probably a good transition into what we're talking about today for you to maybe kind of give a summary of what the book is about, and then I'm going to have a bunch of questions that I've got lined up.
Well, look, I mean, we all know how politics are infused with such powerful emotions. I mean, just watch what's happening in the US on the news any given day. There's people yelling into the camera, raising their fists, spit coming out of their mouths. It just the comments of what in the comment section of what we're going to talk about. It's just there's so many powerful emotions tied to politics, and sometimes it comes out in ways that can be very destructive. It can tear societies apart. And so this book was, the intention was to help us understand why. Where does it come from? And I think one of the best ways to look at psychological phenomena is to look at its evolutionary roots, because that tends to answer the why of a particular behavior. And politics can be confusing. I mean, there's this morass of information coming through the airwaves. There's all kinds of inner workings that are hard to understand. And there's a lot of manipulations, but evolutionary science boils things down to the why, the ultimate cause. And so this book was about where do all these impasses come from? How did we get Donald Trump? By the way, I'm apologizing on behalf of half of the United
Somebody
States.
should.
Somebody should,
Somebody
right?
should.
Just, I want the world to know, I'm sorry. Half of us are trapped with the other half who voted for him, or just under half. But in part to explain that phenomenon, because I mean, the guy's just totally an imbecile and crazy and hostile and destructive, and the whole world knows it. The whole world knows it. As much as I try to be neutral as a social scientist, as an author, objectively, this guy is off his rocker and he's incompetent. And world leaders from around the world, talk about that. Gavin Newland's a British member of parliament, has said, I've tried to use more parliamentary words to describe him, but he is in fact an idiot. The whole world says that.
Yeah.
So how do we get him? Why are we so polarized? Why does this happen so much across history along partisan lines?
Yeah. So
In a
that's one of
nutshell.
the first things that I wanted to talk about. I have a bunch of questions. But the first thing I want to talk about is polarization, because it could just be a selection bias. It could just be because I exist now and I'm observing things now. But it seems as though the degree of polarization is higher now than it's ever been. People don't cross political aisles as often. When, growing up for me, I'm relatively old. I'm kind of old. I don't look it, obviously, but I'm kind of old. So I've voted a lot. I've voted in many elections, and I've switched parties before because the person that I was discussing things with, like if I was talking to a candidate, their platform seemed a little bit more appealing to me. But it seems, especially in the States, that there's this intense polarization that you're either red or you're blue, and that there is no in between, and there's rarely ever any crossing. And if you do, it's seen as a betrayal, not just a personal choice. What causes that type of polarization in the political sphere, and why does it trickle down into society to cause us to treat each other in these ways as opposed to just seeing it as a difference of opinion?
Well, the tribalism piece that you tapped upon is big, and I hope that we can talk about that.
Yeah,
There's so much
sure.
to say about this. I mean, there are historical factors. I think in the 1960s and 70s, the civil rights movements really saw mass defection of white Democrats to the Republican Party
Mm-hmm.
for reasons we're going to talk about. I think the growth of ideologically driven media interests like Fox News and conservative radio that drove it. I think the growing alliances between economic conservatives and evangelicals in the 1980s, that all drove it apart. But there are moneyed interests that want to see us behave in a certain way, and they prod our evolved psychology to manipulate us, to do things, often to vote, and in many ways vote against our own interests. And that's been happening. And we also saw foreign interests like Russia manipulating us through social media, in large part, targeting these known psychological hot buttons for us to get us to even become more polarized. So we have to understand where this stuff comes from, or people are going to manipulate us. People who understand it more than us, better than us, they're going to use it to manipulate us. And that's why I try to talk about this stuff so much.
Yeah, no, I think it's important, especially when in these spheres now, people seem to form these camps, and it's this tribalistic sort of behavior. And as you said, there's this evolutionary component to this tribalistic behavior. And once they're entrenched in these camps, I would imagine, it's not, like I said, it's not my sphere of study, but I would imagine, knowing what I know, that there's a series of biases wrapped in incentivization to remain in those camps, because you become almost a member of that in group, and it's difficult to cross the line to go in the other direction, and the systems that are built up around it don't make it any easier, because they so want us to be polarized and want us to be entrenched in these camps where it's very much an us versus them dynamic, and is difficult to commingle and coalesce and work together to create, to see ourselves as one unit and common good. It's better to have us polarized so that they can create these battles that people are incentivized to win, as opposed to seeing it as something that we should all be collectively working on together. That's a lot.
Absolutely. I mean, we are tribalistic creatures, and I really do think that tribalism is one of the big dangers facing humanity. It always has been.
Mm-hmm.
It's been at the root of so much destruction. Um, so the thing is, we evolved. We spent most of our history in small bands of hunter gatherers, topping out at about 200 people, that were very close knit, competing with other bands of hunter gatherers, and that is how our brains evolved. And you see the limitations of that, and and you know in businesses, groups top out at about that number where they stop functioning if they're in larger chunks than that number. In the military, same thing. In social groups, they start to break down when they grow larger than that number. But you have to understand how in our evolutionary past, being rejected from the tribe was a death sentence. I mean,
Right.
I often play the thought experiment of, imagine if they dropped you or me off in the middle of the Serengeti with nothing but a loincloth.
I'd be
how
dead in
how
three
long
days.
would it take us to get ravaged by nature?
Yeah, maybe a day.
Maybe a
I wouldn't
day if
last
we're
long at
lucky.
all.
Yeah, even the best survivalist wouldn't last very long,
Mm.
So we needed each other. Being abandoned by the tribe was very dangerous. So we developed a psychology to prevent us from being abandoned by the tribe. And one of the things that we do is we show commitment to the tribe in various ways to prevent from being abandoned, to show that we're trustworthy. Signals of commitment.
Is
Um,
that why breaking from groups is so emotionally traumatic? I hadn't thought about it that way before. Like emotional
Absolutely.
connections to an in group, so like a family or a social network or a community. When you break from that group, it becomes an incredibly traumatic experience. And if that was, this is me thinking out loud because I just hadn't thought of it that way before. If that's built into us intrinsically because we evolutionarily were socialized that if we weren't able to get along with this group that we were essentially reliant upon, if we got exercise from the group, then we would die. So that's a
yeah.
traumatic. So we're kind of wired that this is trauma. That emotional experience is almost like an existential dread potentially that's ingrained in us because we could potentially die if we're segregated from our group.
It is an existential dread. It can
Oh,
be, and
interesting.
that's why people have such reluctance to go against to
Right.
consensus, even when they know it's
I hadn't
wrong.
thought
I
of it like
mean,
that.
when you take an objective look at Donald Trump, for example, is he really a true Christian? His
Oh,
two
pff,
Corinthians,
I'm a
his
better
three wives.
Christian.
I'm a better Christian. I'm an atheist.
Me
Um,
too.
but going against whatever idea the group has glommed onto, whether it's a religious idea, political idea, or Donald Trump as our savior idea,
Mm,
it's very frightful to go against a group. Not only being rejected from the group, but Richard Wrangham wrote this great book called the Goodness Paradox, where he makes a very convincing case for the fact that one of the things that made us so cooperative as a species compared to other proto-humans and other primates
mm,
is that we self-policed and we domesticated ourselves. So people who were overly aggressive or who just went against group norms,
yeah.
they weren't only excommunicated, they were executed. And there's a tons of evidence about supporting that I highly recommend that book to understand that hunter-gatherer tribes will execute people who aren't playing ball.
Mm.
So not only fearing rejection, but fearing your tribes mates. If we spent a long time of our human evolution with that kind of threat, we're gonna do all we can to go along with the group and be very careful about saying anything that goes against group consensus.
I wonder if
That's
that's
the
why
danger.
morals are so entrenched in group. I go off on tangents, I'm sorry, but this is making me think because people often say things like, well, morals are something that you just sort of innately sort of tacitly understand, right? They're just this thing that we have that we already were born understanding these morals. But if we're wired essentially to understand what's required in order for an effective codependent group dynamic, then yeah, it would be something that we understand because we required those sort of codependent group dynamics. And that means that there were certain sets of rules and standards in order to have stasis in that group that needed to be adhered to. So the people that were wired more likely to adhere to those standards were more likely to survive and thus pass on those neurological traits.
Right. Go along with the group, safety in numbers. I mean,
Yeah.
we're relatively weak compared to other animals. We're not especially fast. We're not especially strong. We don't have armor. We don't have stabbing appendages, but we can
God, I wish I
cooperate.
did. That would be so cool.
That would be so cool. Praying mantis. But we don't. But we can cooperate, right? And
Yeah.
that we can coordinate action and being able to agree on to be able to have consensus, to be able to decide who's part of the in group and who's not, to police group norms. That was incredibly helpful in our past. And here's the thing:
Mm.
we humans are incredibly good at understanding other people's minds. This idea called mind reading. We have theory of mind. We can understand that other people have thoughts, intentions, beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
We're also very good at detecting false beliefs, relatively speaking. And so we're good at understanding who's cooperating and who's not, detecting cheaters, right? Well, because of that, we've also developed a way to hide our own beliefs if they go against group norms from ourselves, because the people who can deceive others, they lie to themselves. You've heard of that idea that the best liars are self-deceivers. The sociopaths lie to themselves. That's how they can be effective.
Mm-hmm.
To escape others' cheater detection modules. Well, a lot of these people, I mean, this has huge implications for religion. It has huge implications why people can say Donald Trump is our savior. He's a moral Christian. He has our best interests in mind.
Blows my mind.
It's self-deceit. People deceive themselves in order to fit in, and that is huge.
Yeah, they create
That's
justification networks, it seems, that they use as a method to deceive themselves. That's what it looks like. You know better than me. You know more about this stuff than I do. But from the outside in, not just with Donald Trump, but with lots of different things, people seem to create these networks of justifications to support their positions that are relatively flimsy. And when people point out that they're flimsy or point out the hole that's in it, they'll immediately sort of goalpost shift to get away from the dissonance that causes. And then they'll other you immediately and accuse you of attacking them or it being a personal attack or you not being reasonable so that they can escape that dissonance in order to retreat back into that, self-delusion that they created.
Absolutely. And when you think of it in terms of to self-deceive, all of that stuff makes perfect sense. That helps people to self-deceive, to do all these logical contortionisms to get away from the facts, whatever it is. There's a real, motivated reasoning to deflect information that causes anxiety. There's this great study looking at how people will engage in motivated reasoning about their preferred political candidate.
Mm-hmm.
And so, what happens is the way these studies were conducted were subjects were presented with something that their preferred candidate said that was contradictory, that was obviously contradictory.
Mm-hmm.
And watching people engage in motivated reasoning, making excuses for why this person took this stance that went against what he or she said before. The interesting part is that this study was conducted in an MRI machine. And what the MRI machine showed was that all the fear centers of the brain, all the centers of the brain that had to do with threat and pain, and the amygdala just went boom and threat. So that tells you that, going against an idea that's supported by your group really triggers this threat centers of the brain.
Oh, that is fascinating.
I knew you'd like that with all your neuropsych background.
Yeah. So what that tells me is that it's not, and I think that these are important things to understand when you're engaging with people too, because I think a lot of people assume that people are, willfully ignorant because they have malicious intentions. Right. And they're thinking this way because they have malicious intentions. But it sounds to me like you're saying that may not be the case. It may be that they're incorporated into an in-group that's essentially convince them that this is, what we're doing and you kind of need to go along with us. Otherwise, we're going to other you. And that triggers a danger center, which triggers all of these justifications and rationalizations in order to keep holding a belief that they even themselves may not hold otherwise if they weren't incentivized through fear to retain it.
Exactly. That's a great point, because I think there are certain temperamental differences that make people more inclined to be liberal or conservative, and,
Sure.
and I can unpack that a little bit for you. But
Okay.
there are some people who are temperamentally one way in a camp that thinks differently, and they just go along with it. I mean, we can look at religion is a good example of that. How many people have you met that said, I just have went along for so many years because I didn't want to make waves, but I never believed, because I didn't want to get ostracized, because then what would I do?
Kept going to church for 10 years, even though I didn't believe a thing that anybody was saying, because I just didn't want to rock the boat, and I thought that people might be sad, like that sort of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and reject me, and then
Yeah.
then what will I do?
Yeah.
So the temperamental differences, I think that's probably something interesting to talk about. So when we look at certain traits, they fall on the natural curve, and people probably remember that from high school biology, that curve that kind of looks like a bell, so like fear sensitivity. Some people are highly sensitive to fear. Most of us fall right in the middle, and some people are way less sensitive to fear. Well, natural selection has a way of maintaining that shape, because people who are too sensitive to fear, they're not going to take necessary risks that they need to take for survival, right? People who are too fearful, they're going to do a bunch of stupid shit to get them weeded from the gene pool. Right?
They're going to win Darwin Awards.
That's the Darwin Awards, and most of us fall somewhere in between, right? That's how these traits get maintained in that shape, or any given trait, any particular trait. Well, fear of outsiders falls on that curve. And on one end, you have people who are highly fearful of outsiders. Most of us fall somewhere in between. And on the other end, you have people who are not afraid of outsiders much at all. One end we call xenophobia, and there's actually a term for the other end that we call xenophilia. So the idea is that in our evolutionary past, there were certain dangers to trusting outside people. Our evolutionary past was far, far, far more violent than it is today. If you want a great book referral for that, Better Angels of Our Nature by Steven Pinker. Blows your mind. Fantastic book. So hostile outside tribes could spear you if you went to go talk to them. You could catch infectious disease from them. There's all kinds of problems with that. But on the other hand, interfacing with outside tribes had its benefit too. Prevented you from inbreeding. You could meet new mates with genes that could benefit you. You could share technologies. Resource pooling, technology, all that kind of stuff. Well, we fall on the natural curve. Now, when you use political orientation to predict where you fall on the natural curve, it maps on almost perfectly.
Conservatives are fear of outsiders, right?
Across the whole world.
Did I nail it? Yeah, I thought so.
Nailed it.
Yeah.
And that's probably one of the most robust findings across the literature of the biology of politics, And you can't say that without ruffling feathers. But it's the truth, and we have to take a hard look at ourselves in the mirror if we want to overcome some of the.
And that's why there's such status quo retainers, because things are working now. Don't change it. That's scary.
Don't change it. That's scary.
And
we
other
like the status
people
quo.
might come in and they're going to change things. Things aren't going to be different. Our dynamics are going to change. I don't like that either. What if they're bad?
That's why people on the conservative end are more hawkish in their foreign policy. They're more tough on border security, especially in the United States. That's why there tends to be a lot more racism on that end. That's why, and it's not just racism. Xenophobia just means fear of anybody who's outside your group. So it could be a political orientation. It could be a sexual orientation, whatever.
Yeah.
Whereas liberals tend to be more open to outsiders. They tend to be, Black Lives Matter, or speaking a different language, traveling more. Mm-hmm. People who are more liberal travel to foreign countries more. They tend to speak a foreign language more. So that's huge. So really, I mean, those of us who are temperamentally more tribalistic tend to be more conservative. And that's not to say that there aren't tribalistic people on the left. There are. We're all tribalists, but it's a matter of degree, and it's a matter of tie to intense emotions, centers of the brain.
Oh, that's really fascinating to me because I hadn't thought about it like that. So how do you, is there a way to accommodate for it then from like a realistic perspective? Because we know that it seems like a perfect storm right now. Sorry, I think out loud. Because we have these innate tendencies to be tribalistic, and we exist on this distribution, this standard distribution of temperamental aspects of ourselves that get us kind of politically to congregate together. But then, knowing those things, people outside of us are using they're propagandizing and manipulating and using social media in order to reinforce these innate traits that we have and exploit them to turn us against each other. Is it just awareness to get people like how do you counter that? What's the solution? Do you have any ideas?
I think that's huge. I think awareness is huge, and that is one of the things why I'm so excited about this new YouTube channel. I'm
Me
so excited about
too.
what you're doing. I'm so excited about what all the people who are putting out free thought content are doing, because this is like informational guerrilla warfare, right? You have these huge media conglomerates that control the narrative,
Yeah.
and they're owned by other corporate interests that are very big and have a financial incentive to get us to think a certain way, you know. Um, so who's going to put out this content, you know? So I think more content like this. I think teaching critical thinking skills in public school system. I think making people aware of these evolutionary drives so that they don't get manipulated. I'll give you a good example of how they get manipulated.
Hmm.
During the 2018 congressional elections in the US, um, there was this migrant caravan ominously marching towards the US border, trying to cross. And it was spectacularly timed to coincide with the 2018 congressional elections. I don't even know. Has there ever been a caravan? I mean, usually people are trying to cross the border. They're doing it under the dark of night. I mean, how do they expect to cross? I don't know. Not to be conspiratorial about it, but the closer you got to the elections, the closer this caravan came. So Fox News was airing these segments saying this caravan, they're coming, they're criminals, and they're bringing disease, they're bringing smallpox. Well, there's
So
also research showing that conservatives tend to be more germ phobic than liberals, right? And we can talk about that, how that doesn't make sense because
what I was just gonna say, but they will not put on
COVID.
a mask.
Yes.
But
Let's
are
talk
they?
about this.
Can that be overcompensated for by their individual liberty thoughts about being controlled and having like their personal freedoms being infringed upon? They're willing to take risks and maybe do those justifications to themselves that the risk is mitigated or doesn't exist in order to retain those freedoms because they prioritize them.
I think well, let me just finish this point and then I'll
Yeah,
get to
yeah.
that question,
Sorry.
because that's a great question, and
Okay.
that's a great question, and that's what one of the next YouTube videos is going to be about, because
Ooh.
it's a total contradiction, right?
Yes.
But that is how Fox News got the more fear sensitive people in the populace to vote a certain way. Look, smallpox has been eradicated since 1980, but they're saying they're bringing smallpox. Give me a break. They're trying to get people all worked up who are more fear sensitive to vote for the party that's promising tougher border security.
From a
And often these
communication propaganda perspective, them utilizing something like smallpox also gives them an out later, because then if nothing happens, they can just say, well, they had a strain of smallpox or whatever, and it was eradicated. We weren't trying to get you scared. And then they have an out when nothing happens. So it doesn't look like they were attempting to be alarmist, which is clever propagandizing, actually, to choose
they
that as
know
opposed to
this
some other
evolutionary
disease.
research.
Yeah.
It's clever propaganda. They know this evolutionary research,
Yeah.
because that's not on accident.
No, that
A
wouldn't
lot of
be.
these political interests have endless amounts of money to do research on our political psychology, and
Yeah.
they're whispering in the ears of all these politicians. They're controlling what gets to the airways.
And
But
they financially gain from getting us all worked up. They're appealing to the devils of our nature, not the better angels. Because that's one of the things about, I keep getting off track and I'm really sorry because I'm super excited about this. But that's why like content like mine doesn't have as much of a reach as the content of people that are just saying nonsense that, worked at a grocery store or whatever and just started screaming into the internet
yeah,
about
Yeah.
whatever, like those are
Yeah.
going to get more reach. They're going to get put in front of people more because there's financial incentives that go behind propagating these types of things. And also, us as people are more interested in watching this like dynamic conflict than thinking things through.
Absolutely. I mean, the motion centers of the brain, they're that's what sells, you
Right.
know. But
Back to your
think about
caravan. Sorry.
right.
I didn't mean
No,
to
I
take
mean
it.
back to the caravan. I mean that's the thing. Usually it's to support legislation that also includes, tax breaks for billionaires in addition to, whatever they're promising for border security. I mean it's sleight of hand,
Yeah.
you know. But what I think what's happened with COVID is that mask wearing or not wearing a mask has become a badge of tribal commitment. For
Oh.
whatever reason, I think in part because the right, especially the highly religious right, tends to be more anti-science, and there are economic interests to opening up the country again. And so it had become a meme that just spread to get people to show commitment to the group. I'm not afraid of it. I'm not afraid of it. It's like the same thing as wearing a MAGA hat. It's showing I'm with you, you know, and it goes against this pretty well demonstrated fear of germs,
Yeah.
because part of protecting ourselves in throughout our history was not only rejecting the out group, staying away from germs, staying away from outsiders, but our commitment to the in group.
Right.
So people on the right tend to be way more patriotic, which involves like my group is better, my group.
Okay.
So
I have so many more questions,
so it's
but
become a dangerous badge of courage. It's dangerous. It's bad for them. It's bad for the people who are walking out contracting COVID at Trump campaign rallies or golf courses or things like that. It's ironic.
dude, people who are more on the conservative side of the spectrum in political ideologies tend to have more innate or inherent trust in whoever's the chosen leader of that group, to potentially even to their own detriment. Do they have more unfailing loyalty in that regard? And could that
Yeah,
feed into it?
absolutely. There was this really prominent Canadian psychologist named Robert Altemeyer who developed a scale called right-wing authoritarianism. And it really is one of the foundational measures of what underlies political conservatism. And one of the factors was ceding control up to authority figures. You know, um, um, Another one is identifying outsiders as a threat. Being hostile towards outsiders. And the third factor was was going along with group norms, right?
Yeah.
And people who have more um, right wing political leanings score way higher than it. It's really a measure of right wing psychology.
Are they
Um,
are they better or at least more successful, historically speaking or generally speaking, at retaining group stasis than somebody who falls more on the liberal end or the inclusive end, less on the fear of outsider end of that distribution on the bell curve? Like, if it like, because it seems to me sometimes, and I'm super left. I am just, give everybody the money and social networks. I'm like, here's your free health care. Let the immigrants in if they need a place to go. Maybe they can have a better life here. I am LGBTQIA plus. Trans rights are human rights. Trans women are women. I am all the lefties all at once, and I even have green hair. And it seems to me that these conservative groups are far better at being loyal to one another even despite disagreements and retaining that group cohesion than people who are on the left end of the spectrum are. Because I'm not sure if it's because people that are on the left end of the spectrum are constantly striving for more inclusion and are more prone to hold their own people accountable and maybe even exile them than somebody on the conservative end of the spectrum is. Like, maybe they're more interested in retaining who they currently have, and the left is more interested in retaining a specific type of person that's going to help them with progressive tendencies. And I don't know. It's something I've always struggled with, but I think it seems to be the case that conservatives are really good at retaining their groups and maybe even making them larger. And the more liberal side of the spectrum seems to be really good at all just arguing with each other and pissing each other off sometimes. What do you think
Well,
that
if
is?
you're more likely to question the hierarchy, if you're more
Yeah,
likely to question group norms, and say,
right.
hey, norms can be different across groups, right?
Yeah.
It's not only what we think here, it's, Japan does it this way. This other tribe across the mountain does it this way. There's different ways to look at things. Well, yeah, you're going to question things. It's like herding cats sometimes. A
Uh-huh.
bunch of free thinkers are harder to organize.
It's true.
Um,
Especially if they
and I
don't kowtow
think
to authority, like you said, that they're more prone to. Yeah, right. That makes
yeah,
sense.
you're not going to obey. You're not going to obey the leader and fall under the leader's,
Right.
outstretched arms. And
Mm-hmm.
so it may be harder to organize people who are true psychological liberals.
Yeah, that makes sense. How do you? It just, it's something I lament though currently because I see the political climate as it is, and one of the strengths of that, the group that I think is a detriment to human rights, the group that's the largest detriment to everything that liberals think that they're fighting for is this, like, seems to be aggregating and retaining, and instead of creating coalitions, a lot of the time people who are liberals are seem to be more prone to create much more smaller individual ideological camps as opposed to working together. And I'm just wondering if there's an evolutionary reason that leads to that form of psychology.
Well, we're all, I don't mean to imply that the people on the left can't be. We all needed a tribe to survive.
Yeah.
It's a matter of degree, not kind. It's a continuous, not a categorical variable.
Yeah.
So I think the left certainly has their own purity tests.
Mm.
I mean, and sometimes the left can be science denying too, questioning authority, like not trusting, not trusting vaccines because they see pharmaceutical companies as an authority figure to mistrust, for example,
Right.
um, or being so, we all commit some logical fallacies, sometimes based on where we fall evolutionarily, like on the scale of liberal and conservatism. So, for example, people on the right are more likely to commit the fallacy that, well, because evolutionary science, for example, shows that there are gender differences between sex differences between men and women, that justifies discrimination based on sex, right? That's a fallacy.
Yeah.
But people on the left might say something like, well, because discrimination by sex is wrong, there can't be any sex differences. Men and women are identical, and that's a fallacy too. I mean, there are fallacies on both ends that I think deserve looking at. And the left has its own way of policing group norms. I mean, it became really a heresy to criticize Islam, for example, because that you would be labeled as being
Islamophobic.
Islamophobic, for example, because we're so inclusive that we're gonna exclude you if you're not exclusive. It's ironic.
Yeah.
you know
That one I think had a triggering event though. I think because of like when you go back to 9/11, after that there was such a like wave of people attacking people who were Muslim
Yeah,
that I think there's this pendulum of overcompensation where people feel as though, okay, well now clearly we've caused harm to that group, or people like us or people in general have caused harm to that group. Now we need to do what we can to protect them. They become a group that needs to be protected, and they are elevated to that status. So any criticism of their ideology is seen as a criticism of that group as a people, and then they conflate the two in order to make that argument because they're afraid that the same thing is going to happen again.
sure. And that could be just as self-defeating as not wearing masks.
Yes, I agree, because
I
Islam is
mean,
some messy bullshit.
it's some messy bullshit.
Yeah.
And other people have done a really good job of kind of tackling this issue about like, wearing a hijab. Is it really a free choice? Is it really a symbol of culture, or is it a sign of oppressing women? And does it also correspond to acid attacks and genital mutilation and keeping people swathed in drapery and locked away?
And stoning
Because
deaths and yeah.
they're, yeah,
Hmm.
but sometimes if you say that in certain circles, people on the left will say, man, you are a racist, don't you're expelled.
Yeah.
So we all have this tribalistic psychology. I think it's important to understand where it comes from, you know um, because it's so volatile. It's so irrational. Politics can be so irrational. Human groups can be so irrational, and because of this long history of what it meant to go against the group,
Yeah.
it's scary.
Why do you?
So
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
no, please.
I just have so many questions, and I see some people starting to ask questions. If you send super chats, I'll see them at the end. And if you're not sending super chats, wait until I tell you, and make sure you tag me at the end, because I won't be able to scroll all the way up. Like 20-ish minutes, I promise. I'm just not done. So why do you think something like politics in general just ended up bubbling to the surface as something that even exists within societies? Is it just because we need leaders? We need somebody to, wrangle the group. Otherwise, we're gonna scatter to the wind. What do you think in that
Yeah, I
regard?
think. I mean, politics can be defined a number of ways. I mean, it's the simplest way. I think it's just a method to manage human affairs, and
Mm-hmm.
allocating resources, and dividing resources, and considering foreign policy. But all of this is rooted in some very ancient psychology. And I think another thing that undergirds where you fall on the spectrum of left and right has to do with the the social dominance hierarchy. I mean, we are social primates that have lived in social hierarchies for most of our evolution. Even though hunter gatherers are a lot more egalitarian than we are now, there was always a hierarchy of some sort. And um, our orientations are critical for helping us navigate the rungs of the hierarchy. People who are liberally oriented tend to be support far more egalitarian ideas than people on the conservative end. And usually people on the liberal end are marginalized. LGBT, ethnic minorities, women, by far support causes of the left more than other people. Um, Supporting things like free college tuition, free healthcare for all, equal pay for women, food stamps, things like that, which seek to level the playing field. Well, if you're lower on the primate hierarchy, that's going to help you rise up above the hierarchy. If you're in a position of privilege, you don't want to fall down the ranks, so you want to maintain the status quo. You want to maintain your privilege, and you're going to do whatever you can, whether it's a political ideal or something else, to maintain that privilege. And that's what the right tends to champion. And it tends to be way supported by men, because men tend to control, for our whole history, tend to control resources more than women do. And embedded in all this, which is another tangent we could go on, is our reproductive psychology. But I think where we are in the hierarchy has huge implications for our fitness, because the higher you're up on the hierarchy, the more access to resources that you need for genetic fitness, which means how much you can propagate your genes across the generations. So it's all very primitive. It's all very primitive, and that's why it's so volatile.
Yeah, and so many people. I've always said that I think that even at least an introduction to psychology course should be taught at the high school level, and also an introduction to like logic or reason, like some sort of class on thought, like how to think, and a class on how everyone thinks, like a psychology class and a class on logic should be something that everybody has to go to, because so much of what's thrown at us in society is very carefully cultivated in order to manipulate our psychology, because so few of us are even aware of our psychology. We like to think of ourselves as these just, like very empirically reasonable, like people who aren't to be manipulated or persuaded, and that not me, not I am the paragon of reason, and that I can't be manipulated. But you are manipulated 5 times before you probably get in your car in the morning, by ads you see, by what you see on Twitter. Like,
Yeah.
anytime somebody introduces something to you that makes you feel a certain kind of way, that's a form of manipulation. Like, they're eliciting an emotion from you, which is going to affect behavioral patterns as a result. And many people don't do it on purpose, but that's a thing that happens. The people that are really good at figuring out how to elicit effectual behavioral patterns and emotional patterns, those people are going to utilize those as tools in order to
Yeah.
get you to feel and think a certain kind of way, and tell other people how you feel and think a certain kind of way, so that behavior can propagate. And people
They're
just
the
don't seem to
master of
get it.
puppets. You said so many good things there. I mean, yeah, we have to teach this stuff in school. We have to teach all these logical fallacies at a very young age. Usually those in positions of power historically have been against that. They've
Wonder.
controlled what kind of information comes down to the masses. I wonder why, because
Yeah.
knowledge helps you challenge the power structure.
Mm-hmm.
Just think of what books have been allowed through the course of our history, what books have been banned, or reading only one book, or not even be able to read a book. Those who have, positions of authority reading to you that book in the way they want you to understand it.
Mm-hmm.
That has been a ruse that's gone on forever. But you're right. There are a lot of manipulations, and there's a pretty good body of research showing that when we're afraid, we're more manipulable. And that's the thing. That's what we have to be aware of. How fear is leveraged to get us to behave in a certain way.
Yeah, that's interesting. And who is trying to keep you afraid would be a good thing to look out for too. Who
And
is,
for what purposes?
yeah, and what do they, like, are they eliciting fear from you or attempting to elicit fear from you? And what do they say you should do to quell that fear?
And this is a controversial thing to say, but it's empirical. There's a lot of studies show that the more fearful among us also tend to be more politically conservative. And I like to say it in that direction because we developed fear millennia before we had anything resembling modern day politics.
Mm-hmm.
It's these old instincts that get expressed through politics and religion. But like people who are highly partisan on the right, they actually have larger amygdala. There's been
Oh,
studies looking at brain brain structure.
ooh, that's interesting. This is all really interesting stuff because I never look at the evolutionary political side of things. So this is super fascinating to me. I
Yeah,
wonder if, because fear is one of the oldest and most innate responses that any species of any ilk has, really,
right,
because it's a base of survival response, right?
right.
So, since we didn't initially exist in groups, but the fear would have existed prior to us realizing that we could cohabitate in groups and that would be beneficial to us. It seems as though our fear responses had to kind of be assimilated and then repurposed within the dynamics of that group.
Right.
And if they had to be assimilated and repurposed within the dynamics of that group, that would have immediately made them exploitable, which would be how power dynamics kind of would have come to the top. Whoever could elicit them just the right amount of fear, because too much and the person will come and get you, or the group will come and get you,
Right.
and
Right.
not enough, and people won't be enough afraid of you that they'd fall in line behind you.
Yeah. Yeah. So
It's
you're
interesting.
right. I mean, just looking at chimpanzee troops. You have an alpha male who's especially despotic. Well, eventually there's going to be an alliance that'll just kill that individual.
Right.
That happens, and that happens across our history as well. So learning but on top of all this, we've become less power oriented than we were in our ancestral past. When you look at other animals, we managed to agree a lot more with one another. We've managed to cooperate a lot more. I
Mm.
mean, I focus on the dark sides of humanity because I think those sides need focus for continued growth, towards continued progress. But overall, we get along pretty well. I mean, considering how we were when we were hunter gatherers, I mean, especially men. I mean, men up to 30-40% of men in hunter gatherer tribes are wiped out from violence from by rival tribes by male on male violence. That's a huge selective pressure. But that has changed drastically. We're getting along a lot better.
Mm-hmm.
The more we understand these kinds of things, the more we bring all these unconscious processes to the conscious level for examination, the more we decide, hey, which of these serves us today?
Right.
Does it still serve us to be really circumspect and suspicious of outside groups as we're moving towards globalization, whether we want to or not?
Mm-hmm.
Does it really serve us as our economies are merging, as our cultures are merging, as our ideas are merging, to be insular? And may have in our past.
Yeah.
So we have to decide. We have to ask, and it's hard to ask these questions because it pings on all these volatile emotions that have to do with signifying tribal loyalty.
Yeah, and identity is so entrenched within that too, like cultural identity, political identity, national identity. All of those things are wrapped up in that as well, and they're something that means a great deal to a lot of people. Like, I'm pretty psyched about being Canadian all day, every day. That's something that I really, really enjoy. Oh, I had a question, and it was a fantastic question, and I lost it for a second because I get so excited about being Canadian. Just sometimes I just get really excited about being Canadian, and I lose my entire train of thought.
There you go.
Yeah, right. There you go. There you go, eh?
There you go, eh?
There you go, eh, bud? I think it had to do with power. Oh, yes, it had to do with globalization. So, do you think a lot of this increase that we see, or at least I perceive, it doesn't necessarily mean that it is there, it's just something that I personally perceive, might, like, this increase in, like, fighting back and pushing back and what seems to be polarization might almost be kind of like the death pangs of these tribalistic tendencies, because now we are so interconnected in a way that it's much more difficult for people to other each other, because we're so able to reach across the world and connect with people and find out that we have more similarities than differences, and learn about them and not have as much misconceptions about them. It becomes more difficult to be really tribalistic. And if you are inherently tribalistic and other people are attempting to reinforce your tribalistic tendencies, then that can be something that causes a great degree of dissonance, confusion, and elicits emotional response. And this could be kind of like the death pangs of that form of our society existing, because now the dynamics have changed so drastically, so quickly.
I would love to see it that way. I would love to see it as the last death pangs of our tribalistic nature. That would be great. I think maybe in a cultural sense it can be. It certainly is kind of a descending sawtooth kind of configuration where we get less tribalistic, but there are upticks. But overall, it's a downward trend.
Yeah.
The 2016 election is an exception. And I think a lot of Donald Trump phenomena just really tapped into our
blows my mind.
Ancient emotions that have to do with big, loud, brash leaders. I mean,
could that be a
and
callback,
I think,
though, because people see it slipping out through their fingers, and they're kind of like, oh, I need the most viscerally, outward sort of archetypical version of this thing that is accessible to me in order to feel okay, in order to be comfortable.
Maybe
anymore.
So. He's certainly that archetypal knuckle dragging, chest thumping chimpanzee type. I mean,
Fair.
I've made that case publicly. Jane Goodall's made that case publicly. I mean, it's just so primitive and, gosh, frankly stupid. But yeah, maybe. I mean, I think a lot of people were very incensed that we had a black president, and it's a compensation for that.
Think of that.
So
you think people were? It was another one of those pendulum swings where people were like, "We're going to do the exact goddamn opposite of this. which is
Yes,
this.
we're going to go with somebody who cannot form complete sentences and who is a racist and big and white and loud and dumb. Yeah, I think so. Who's really going to promise anyway to champion our interests, you know. I mean,
Yeah.
Donald Trump said Christianity's going to have power again. We're going to have power. And that's one of the reasons why evangelicals glommed onto him so strongly.
And he's also saying that Joe Biden is attempting to take away religious freedom. I was like,
Yeah. Again, the tapping those fears, right? Tapping fears. Fear is
yeah,
the great manipulator.
right.
Absolutely.
Because people
And
will err
so,
on the side of caution if it's something that they personally want to retain or feel in any way is a threat. They will absolutely lose their rationality in order to retain that thing that's important to them.
particularly if you're dispositionally more fearful, right? You're more inclined to do that. And a lot of people, myself included, tend to get really pissed off at the Trump supporters who respond to these obvious manipulations, but in many ways they represent the more vulnerable members of our society across the world. I mean, people who are more fearful are more manipulable. And
Yeah.
so I kind of see it as like we have to protect people who are more manipulable. We protect them by providing education and critical thought.
Exactly. Arming them with the tools. Like you don't protect people that are prone to manipulation by manipulating them yourself to do the thing that you want them to do. You teach them how to not be manipulated.
Teach them how to think, not what to think. Teach them how to think.
That's
You
right.
know,
Yeah. We
and
don't
we
do enough of
need
that.
more of that, like a breath of life itself in the U.S.
And
Again, I'm sorry.
no, I completely agree because I see you guys dismantling your education system too to a degree that is intensely troubling. Intensely
It is.
troubling. The dismantling of the education system and the privatization of the education system is really, really troubling down there. Like
Yeah.
removing anything that has to do with critical critical thinking, having exhausted it's and hungry students, removing
Hey,
food
I
programs so
live in
that
Texas. I don't know if you heard of the fight with the Texas State Board of Education that had
I
been going
do.
on for so long,
Yeah.
fighting for
I'm friends with
for
Aaron, so I know, and Matt.
right, right. There's
Yeah.
a lot of us here
Yeah.
on the front lines,
Mm-hmm.
Aaron and Anthony and a
Yeah.
bunch of other people, Drew.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, the state board had been fighting for equal space to discuss creationism along with evolution. It's just absurd. I mean, why would we go back to the Bronze Age? We've progressed so far beyond that.
And the fact that it even has footing is banana bonkers to me. Like,
It's banana bonkers, man. It's absurd. It's absurd that a nation with so much wealth, so much technology, so much science. I mean, we do a lot of basic science here, a lot of tech. We create a lot of tech and science and
mm-hmm.
research, but how at the same time we could be so backward in so many ways culturally.
Yeah, and in a capitalistic society, you would think you would want to create more innovators. And you're not going to create more innovators by teaching them to distrust science. it's going to have the opposite effect. Like you'll ultimately, in the end, lose your financial power as a nation because you're not doing anything to invest in future generations of your society progressing in any sort of way. All you're doing at this point is just creating sort of ignorant workers that will fill roles for corporations that currently exist and benefit them. You're not.
Precisely. That is why we have to import so many of our brains. That's why we people in the scientific community, in the medical community, we import them from other countries because we do so abysmally at basic science.
Yeah, and
in their
so many of
schools.
especially the food programs really gets me because there's so many children who could aspire to astounding and wonderful things if they had the equal opportunity for education. And equal opportunity for education means that all the circumstances should be held equally. And if there's a child who has food insecurity who shows up and previously that food program was the only thing that kept them from, not having excruciating hunger pangs all day so that they could focus on the classwork, and then you take that away, you're essentially taking away that opportunity. You're keeping
Right.
poor people poor by ruining their opportunities for education. So when I
Yeah.
watched your DeVos lady take away the food programs, I was sour. Sour.
Yeah.
Sour.
The writing's on the wall. This is an authoritarian regime, and it's scary.
If you
It's
can't feed your children, if you guys
no.
can't get on board with feeding your goddamn children, children.
This is where xenophobia, shoots,
What?
will shoot ourselves in the foot and just result in absurdities like and cruel policies
I
like this
shouldn't have to
because
share with their children because they didn't do this, and I feed my children. So if they can't
right.
feed their children, that's their problem. I worked hard. Maybe if they worked hard, they could feed their children. I actually heard somebody say something like that and was
Yeah.
like, "You monster. I'll
Yeah,
feed their children. Give me the
I
kids. I'll
agree.
fucking feed them."
I agree. People
God.
needing those programs are perceived as outsiders, they're
Yeah.
perceived as minorities or outsiders or the other. Then we don't want to share resources with them. And this goes back to, through most of our evolutionary history, we competed hotly for resources from other tribes. Resources were finite. We were at the mercy of nature, right?
Hmm.
Herd migration, seasonal factors that put a strain on us to compete with the other tribes. But now we can feed the world in excess, but we still house these Stone Age brains that really get
Ours.
resentful if somebody else gets something. We
Yeah.
want no. Is there an equal amount? Do they deserve it? Are they from the outside group or not? Who cares? We can eliminate starvation from the human experience. We have the technology to do that now.
Yeah. And imagine what would happen then. Just imagine what would happen.
Imagine what would happen. Imagine what would happen if people had a better start. Imagine what would happen if people were more educated. Imagine what would happen if there were more innovators, like you said.
Mm-hmm.
Life would get better for everybody.
I agree. All right. Well, on that note, I'm going to start asking the questions that people had. So I see there are some super chats. I'll start with them. If you have a question and haven't sent a super chat, make sure you at Shannon Q so that I see it show up in red, because we all know that I'm horrible at monitoring the chat. I hope you guys have been nice to each other, and thank you for the mods. I see the mods in there. I always appreciate you guys. You guys work relentlessly on this channel in the chat, and I appreciate you guys. Thank you. Thank you for always showing up. So the first super chat is from Vibrantly Brantley. Thank you, Vibrantly Brantley. Vote as many times as you feel necessary for the left to win. I don't think that's legal, Brand. I don't think you can do that.
Yeah.
I don't think you can. All right. So Paul from Paulogia has a question for you, Hector. Does falsification play, who you actually met when we were in Austin, does falsification play a role in evolutionary psychology study theorems and conclusions?
Whew, that went where maybe I'm not smart enough to answer that question. Did falsification, no, I don't think
About
so.
like
I
the
mean,
scientific method, like if you have a null and alternative hypothesis, like H1, H0, when you're doing statistical analyses, or if there's
right,
another
the null
form of.
hypothesis, like I'd be able to say to prove something false, I don't know. I'm not sure that comes terribly naturally,
Mhm.
right? I think we have to work at it. I think we have to work at testing our hypotheses and allowing ideas to be falsified. I don't know that we have a predilection for the scientific method per se.
Interesting.
I think it's probably the other way around. We have the tendency to respond just through emotional reasoning far more than Bayesian reasoning.
Oh, you're talking about people in general. I think he's talking about the field. Like in evolutionary psychology, when you're doing studies, do you use like falsification criteria when you're like aggregating data or doing study? Like, would you have a hypothesis and would you use falsification
Oh
criteria?
yeah. So evolutionary in evolutionary science, there are certain ideas that are falsifiable. There was the idea that for example, homosexuality got expressed in a population because of what is the uncle hypothesis or something like that. Because on average, people who are homosexual may help their kin through kin altruism
Oh,
more.
the fecundity hypothesis that
Yeah,
yeah, so women who had large broods of children, it would be more likely that as they went down the line, later children in large, litters of human kids or whatever you call a large amount of human kids, would more likely to present as homosexual, and there was an evolutionary benefit because they would help
right.
watch and raise the kids. Is that
So
okay?
so
Yeah.
that's an example of an evolutionary hypothesis that has been falsified when we look at
Ooh.
like charity between, across gay and straight men. You don't see any greater difference. You don't see any statistical difference. So yeah, there are a lot of ideas that are falsifiable. It's tricky. There's a lot of reverse engineering. There are a lot of hypotheses to be tested. I mean, evolutionary psychology is a field kind of in its infancy
Yeah.
that's been growing, being studied in research labs across the country increasingly. But yeah, that's a great question. I think it's a misunderstanding that these ideas cannot be falsified. A lot of them can and are.
Very cool. All right, thank you. Yeah, sorry. Initially, I thought I can understand. It's probably the way I read the question. I was like, oh, he's answering for humans in general, and Paul was talking about the
No,
field.
that's a great question. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, that's a great
it's a great
question.
question both ways, actually.
Yeah, I think
So
so.
we get the best of both worlds there. So Fran Wilson, thank you, Fran, for the super chat. This is for Titan Uranus. That's the best name ever. All right, what is your opinion of generations theory? I don't know what generations theory is, so I'm assuming that's for you. I don't know what generations theory is.
I'm going to draw a blank there. I don't know what generations theory is. Again, I don't know. Sorry.
Yeah, I don't.
That goes beyond my understanding. Generation. I mean, I could look it up. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe elaborate in the chat if you have the opportunity.
I'm not smart enough for that question. I'm sorry.
I'm sure you are. Both of us are.
But
We just don't know
I
right
will
now.
look it up. And that's the thing. If I don't know stuff, I'll look it up.
On our channel,
What I
we
don't
say
like is people like
advocate for
Jordan
your own
Peterson that'll
understanding.
just make shit up and just talk nonsense for 15 minutes about something that doesn't make no sense.
Yup.
Another one of your people.
Don't. No, I'm Nova Scotian. He's not one of our. He's not part of my tribe. He's one of the
Oh,
other ones.
okay. That's right.
He's from Toronto. It's entirely different. Actually, he's from Alberta, which is even worse. So it's not the same.
I
It's
gotcha.
not the
And
same.
Trump's
Not my
not
in
mine
group.
either, so I gotcha.
Didn't do it. All right. So this is from Isabel G. Could there be a sort of blue dot purple dot effect from the left that seeks and gets in innovation versus the right feeling threatened by getting further away from the old ways?
Yeah, I think I mean, if I understand the question correctly, I think yes, status quo is more glommed onto by the right, because it's the tried way of doing things. If you're more fearful, you're not going to try to innovate because that's risky, you know.
Conservative literally
Um,
means conserves. You keep it.
it means conserve, don't take risks,
Yeah.
go for and there are benefits to that, especially in our ancestral past. I mean, the idea was that people on the left, at least the psychology underlying the left, they're more open to experience. So more likely to emigrate, more likely to move to new lands, talk to new people, discover new resources, new technologies. There's risk to that. There's
Yeah.
certain risks to staying put too, stagnation, inbreeding, you know. So yeah, I think if there's a general trend, and of course there are always exceptions, let's not make the mistake of thinking that there's not. But and generally speaking, I think the psychology underlying the political right tends to be more towards, like you said, conservatism.
Okay.
Tried and true.
Titus, Titan Uranus. Every time I
Again?
say it out loud. Oh, he's a Strauss Howe generational theory is sometimes called fourth turning theory. That doesn't help me, but I don't know if it helps you, but that's him elaborating. From Allison Bright, thoughts on anti-vaxxers? Interesting question. Thoughts on
Yeah,
anti-vaxxers?
I think we talked about that earlier. I mean, there's anti-vaxxers on both the left and the right, and now anti-vaccines has been a meme kind of spreading through the extreme right in the U.S. Like, I'm not going to get a vaccine, heck no,
Yeah.
But I think that tends to be a pathology of the left, like we said, just kind of questioning the authority figures. I think pharmaceutical companies, we should keep an eye on them for their practices and
Sure.
how they control information and unfair market practices around their drugs. But but I think questioning authority so much that you're not going to take a vaccine. I mean, kids die because of that.
Yeah,
So
I think it also there are people who are anti-vax that are really convinced that the vaccines are harming their kids. Like
yeah,
they've become convinced of that. So if you look at the spectrum of, resilience, not resiliency, but can't remember the word I'm looking for, but uh, proclivity towards being fearful of things or wanting to protect from harm. If you fall to the far side of the spectrum and you are the product of an education system that doesn't teach you critical thinking and have tribalistic tendencies and the accessibility to create or find communities that have the same sort of potentially irrational fears and work to reinforce each other, I can see how you would get there, especially where a lot of these people, unfortunately, have children who are on the autism spectrum and feel as though there's this emotional correlation that they have between the time of the diagnosis and the time of first vaccinations. And then we're externally reinforced by documentaries like Vaxxed and false studies that were presented as accurate studies. And so
yeah,
I think vilification of large groups of people because they hold dangerous ideas is in and of itself danger, because they're already creating insular communities, and othering them isn't going to change their mind, which is why outreach and education are more important than vilification.
yeah.
Those are my thoughts.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's what street epistemology is all about. There are methods in clinical psychology that called motivational interviewing that street epistemology is based on. That kind of, if you challenge something directly, especially if it's tied to identity groups,
Mm,
people are just going to become more entrenched.
yeah.
And facts don't matter. Research data. I mean, the Teflon coating of our tribalistic psychology, bing, stuff just like bounces off of that like nothing. So I think some of the techniques used in like street epistemology, where you ask people, Socratic questions to get them to think more critically. That's the way to help people think
Yeah.
more rationally.
And the last question before we go is: are you going to come? Is Hector coming to the next Faithless Forum from Best Name Ever?
Yes, for
Yay!
sure.
Me too.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I was utterly devastated when it was canceled this year. I had my plane tickets booked, my hotel booked, my Airbnb booked, everything ready. But sadly,
Yeah. COVID is cramping everybody's style. That sucked. But yeah, I definitely will go to the next one.
yeah, it's so much fun. I can't wait. Hopefully, knock on wood, we'll be able to do it next year. Maybe things will be sorted out by then, and
Maybe
I
we'll
can
have a
come next year.
vaccine.
Yeah, maybe we'll have a vaccine that I will be the first in line to take, and I can get on a plane and travel again. And I will definitely be at Faithless Forum
That
the
would be
next one that
awesome.
I'm able to cross the border, because currently our border's closed. I'm not allowed to go to America. Not right
See,
now.
sometimes it's smart. Sometimes it's smart, right? We have the highest, infection rate in the world because of,
Do you know how many cases we have in Nova Scotia right now?
I mean,
Two.
oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. That's brilliant.
And we still have mandatory masks. Everybody wears them.
Yeah. Yeah. You obviously don't love freedom there.
We hate it. We hate it so much that we actually have freedoms now because we were so careful that we can congregate in groups of under 50.
That's the thing.
Yeah.
We have a lot of work to do.
We were very careful up front. Like, we locked ourselves inside essentially and ordered our groceries online, everybody who was able to. Like, no, some people don't have the same upward mobility and didn't have that ability. So
Right.
we would, in my town, we were delivering groceries to other people because, they had kids and it was more difficult for them to get out or whatever. We all helped each other so that we could stay locked inside essentially from March until mid to late June. And then by the time summer hit, there was only 12 cases, and we started to slowly roll out that, okay, our restaurants can open, but only outside and only at 50% capacity. You have to wear masks, and slowly started to roll things out, and we've been able to contact trace. Also, we have mandatory tests here. I've had a COVID test because I had a cold. My son goes to public school, and as soon as he has 2 symptoms, they send him home. He has to get a test. Turnaround time 72 hours for a test, and we just go through a drive-through, and everybody who needs a test can get a test, and you get a test even if you don't need it.
The value of being sensible, the value of being science-oriented, the value of being reasonable. What can I say? It's a debacle here, but we look to you. Hopefully we'll look to you for
and
inspiration.
They're both travel related.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then when they came home, the people quarantined. So by the time so they didn't, because it's a mandatory 14-day quarantine here if you travel. So by the time they got back and quarantined and symptoms started to show up, it was okay because they'd only been in contact with the people who were at the airplane or on the airport, and they were able to notify the people on that plane, and they weren't in the province.
Right. Yeah.
And they were also quarantining if they were in the province.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Don't mean to brag, but
oh, don't be sorry. I know it. So all my friends from the U.S. go out and vote.
Vote.
Please go vote.
Vote for the guy who didn't contract it.
Yeah.
All right, Hector. Well, thank you so much. I've been really looking forward to talking to you. I hope you enjoyed it, and I appreciate you being here. All of your links are in the description, so go subscribe to Hector's channel. If you like what I do here, then you'll definitely like what he does because he's way smarter and more educated than I am.
I don't know about that.
But he doesn't have green hair. That's not his fault. Maybe one day.
I could do it.
You could. Anybody can. So, Hector, tell everybody once again before we leave, in case they tuned in late, who you are and where they can find you.
Dr. Hector Garcia. You can find me at hector-garcia.com. My YouTube channel, Dr. Hector A. Garcia. And I just did this Patreon thing that's in the description too. If you want to see me put out stuff, you can become a patron. I'd love that.
Yay.
I want to keep doing this stuff. It's amazing. And so I take inspiration for people like you, people like Drew McCoy, other people who are doing this stuff. You guys are amazing.
I give Drew a lot of crap, but I love that man. He's so sweet. he's a good person. Guy. He's good people. All right. Well, I'm going to throw up my end screen so nobody can see us. I always wave even though no one can see me. And I also have a Patreon and a coffee thing and other stuff. If you guys want to do that, that's cool. If you like what we do on the channel, thank you for being here. Please hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. And as always, everyone, help elevate the discourse. Bye.